The sky over Sicily was empty at first. July 2nd, 1943, 11,000 feet above the airfield at Castelvetrano, the Mediterranean sun bent around the canopy of a battered P-40 Warhawk, and inside that cockpit sat a 22-year-old from Brazil, Indiana, a young black man named Charles B. Hall, his gloved hand resting light on the stick, his eyes scanning the haze for a shape that was not supposed to be there. Then the shape appeared. Two Focke-Wulf 190s, climbing fast toward the American B-25 bomber's hull, had been ordered to protect German fighters, the best of the Luftwaffe, flown by men whose nation had built an entire ideology on the idea that the pilot in this P-40 did not belong here, could not belong here, was biologically incapable of doing what he was about to do. Hall pushed the throttle forward. But to understand what happened in the next 90 seconds, to understand why one burst of machine gun fire over a Sicilian field would matter for the rest of the 20th century, we have to go back, 18 years back, to a quiet office in Washington where a group of American officers had already decided that the moment we are about to witness was impossible. In 1925, the United States Army War College published a document. The title was bureaucratic, almost forgettable, the employment of Negro manpower in war. The conclusions were not. The Negro, the report stated, was of inferior mentality. He was inherently weak in character. He could follow simple orders, but was unfit for combat leadership. He could not, the authors wrote with the calm authority of men who had never been challenged, master the operation of complex machinery. The pages were typed, filed, distributed. They became, for nearly 2 decades, the unspoken doctrine of the United States military. When black Americans asked to fly, the answer was already written. When they asked to lead, the answer was already written. When they asked simply to fight for the country they had been born into, the answer had been written before they were born. But documents do not change the sky. In 1917, in a hangar in France, a young man from Columbus, Georgia named Eugene Bullard climbed into the cockpit of a Spad. He was 22 years old. He was black, and because the United States Army Air Service would not accept him, he had joined the French Foreign Legion, then transferred to the French Air Service, where the color of his skin was not considered relevant to the matter of flight. Bullard flew 20 combat missions. He was credited with shooting down at least one German aircraft. He survived, and when he tried to enlist in the American forces after the United States entered the war, the country he had been born in, he was rejected. 4 years later, in 1921, a 29-year-old woman from Texas walked into the offices of the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale in France and earned an international pilot's license. Her name was Bessie Coleman. No American flight school would teach her, so she had learned French and crossed an ocean. She became the first black woman in the world to hold a pilot's license. By 1939, the Coffee School of Aeronautics in Chicago had quietly trained dozens of black civilian pilots. Across the country, in basements and church halls, black aviators were studying, waiting, watching the headlines from Europe. The report was wrong. The report had always been wrong. The report was about to collide with a war. The first crack came from politics. It was 1940. Franklin Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term, and the math of the election was tightening. He needed black voters in Chicago, in Detroit, in Philadelphia. And those voters were tired of being told that the army that demanded their sons would not let those sons fly. The pressure built quietly at first, then loudly. Walter White of the NAACP. The Labor leader A. Philip Randolph, Judge William H. Hastie, black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, printed editorial after editorial, asking the same uncomfortable question. How could America fight for democracy in Europe while denying it at home? On January 16, 1941, the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, made an announcement. The Army would form a single all-black flying unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. It would be based at a small airfield in Tuskegee, Alabama, but buried in the announcement was a word. A single word that revealed exactly how much had really changed. Experiment. The 99th was not a squadron, it was a test. A test designed by men who already knew in their bones what the result would be. They had read the report. Some of them had written the report. And they were content to let the experiment fail on its own. What they did not count on was March 29th, 1941. Eleanor Roosevelt arrived at Tuskegee that morning. She was 56 years old, the First Lady of the United States, and she had heard the rumors that the airfield was a sham, that the black cadets were being held back deliberately, that Washington was waiting for the program to die quietly. She wanted to see for herself. The chief civilian flight instructor met her at the field, a 34-year-old black man named Charles Alfred Anderson. The cadets called him Chief. Eleanor Roosevelt looked at Anderson. She looked at the small open cockpit Piper Cub behind him, and she said, in the calm, careful voice she used when she had already made up her mind, "I always heard colored people couldn't fly an airplane. I think I'd like to see for myself." The Secret Service objected. She went anyway. For nearly an hour, the First Lady of the United States flew over the cotton fields of Alabama with a black pilot at the controls. When she landed, she was photographed beside Anderson, smiling. The photograph went out across the wire services that same day. It appeared in newspapers from Boston to Los Angeles. A First Lady in a cockpit with a black man in the segregated South of 1941. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, a man who had quietly hoped the Tuskegee program would starve from lack of funding, saw the photograph and understood what it meant. The experiment could not be killed quietly now. The First Lady had made it visible. The money came through that week. The man chosen to command the 99th was already accustomed to silence. His name was Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. He was born in 1912, the son of the first black general in the United States Army. In 1932, at the age of 19, he had walked through the gates of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He was the only black cadet there. He would remain the only black cadet there for 4 years. The other cadets did not speak to him. It was called the silencing, a punishment normally reserved for cadets who had violated the honor code. Davis had violated nothing. He had simply arrived. So for 4 years, at meals, in formation, in the barracks, in the long stone halls, no white cadet spoke to him outside of official duty. He ate alone. He roomed alone, he marched alone, he graduated 35th in a class of 276. He never wrote about anger, he wrote about discipline. About the conviction that the men who had refused to speak to him would one day need him, and on that day he would not fail. In April of 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. boarded a troop ship in Virginia with 26 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron. They sailed across the Atlantic to Casablanca. From there they moved east into Tunisia to a dusty airfield called Farjuna, where they were attached to the 33rd Fighter Group. The commander of the 33rd was a 26-year-old colonel named William W. Mumia. He looked at Davis, he looked at the men behind him, and he made a decision he would not commit to paper for several months. He gave them the missions that did not matter: patrol over the Mediterranean, sweeps where no enemy was expected, hours and hours of empty sky. The 99th flew. They flew well. But they did not fight, because the man who controlled their assignments was not, in any document, ordering them to fail. He was simply ensuring they were never put in a place where they could succeed. By the morning of July 2nd, 1943, the Tuskegee experiment had been in combat for 1 full month and had not yet recorded a single aerial victory. The reports going back to Washington read precisely the way the 1925 War College document had predicted they would. The 99th was not aggressive. The 99th was not effective. The 99th, the reports quietly suggested, should perhaps be withdrawn. 11,000 feet above Castelvetrano, Charles B. Hall did not know any of this. He saw the 2 Focke-Wulf 190s. He pushed the stick forward and dove between them and the bombers. He turned inside the German wingman's arc, a maneuver that should not have worked in a P-40 against a faster aircraft, and worked anyway. He pressed the trigger. 6 machine guns fired together. The tracer rounds reached out across the Sicilian sky and tore through the fuselage of the second Focke-Wulf. The German aircraft began to spin. It fell away from the formation, dropping toward the earth. No parachute, no recovery. It struck the Sicilian countryside in a column of black smoke. It was the first. When Hall landed that afternoon at Farjuna, the black ground crews, men who had spent months being shouted at and shoved aside by the white personnel of the 33rd Fighter Group, ran toward his aircraft. They climbed onto the wings. They lifted him out of the cockpit and onto their shoulders. Somewhere on the base, a bottle of Coca-Cola had been waiting for weeks, saved for the first Tuskegee airman to score a victory. It was opened that evening. Hall drank from it standing in his flight suit, his hands still smelling of cordite. In Washington, General Henry Hap Arnold was already reading another report. This one would call for the disbandment of the 99th Fighter Squadron. The experiment was about to be killed, and the men who had just proven it could fly were about to find out that proving it was not going to be enough. Hap Arnold did not waste paper. In September of 1943, a confidential report from Colonel William W. Mummier reached the commanding general's desk in Washington. It was 3 pages long. It used the word aggressiveness 4 times. It concluded that the 99th Fighter Squadron had failed to demonstrate the qualities expected of an American combat unit and recommended that the squadron be withdrawn from combat operations entirely. Arnold read it twice. He did not need to read it 3 times. He had already begun, in his head, to draft the order that would dissolve the Tuskegee experiment. The report moved through channels with the quiet speed of inevitability. By early October, Time magazine had somehow obtained the substance of it and published an article suggesting that the great experiment in Negro aviation had not worked. The piece did not name Mummier. It did not have to. The conclusion sat on the page like a verdict. The men flying out of Farjuna had been given their chance. They had not taken it. In Tunisia, Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. received a cable. He was to fly to Washington at once. He left without telling his pilots why. There is no photograph of Davis on that flight home, no journal entry, no recorded remark from the airmen and officers who saw him on the long, slow C-54 ride across the Atlantic. There is only this. The man who had endured 4 years of silence at West Point was about to walk into a hearing where every word he spoke would be weighed against the lives and futures of every black pilot in the United States military. Whatever he was carrying inside him, he carried it alone. The hearing convened in the Pentagon in October of 1943. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy chaired the committee. Around the table sat generals and senior officers, men who had read Mummier's report, men who had read the Time article, men who arrived at the meeting having already decided. Davis spoke for less than an hour. He did not raise his voice. He did not plead. He laid out the operational record of the 99th in dry, precise numbers. Every mission flown, every sortie completed, every aircraft engaged, every aircraft lost, and at the end of his presentation he asked the committee one question. What other squadron has ever been judged on this standard? The room did not answer him. But General George E. Stratmeyer ordered an immediate operations analysis. The Statistical Control Section of the Army Air Forces was directed to compare the combat performance of the 99th Fighter Squadron flying obsolete P-40 Warhawks out of dusty African airfields against every other P-40 squadron in the Mediterranean theater across the same period of operations. The numbers came back 6 weeks later. The 99th was equivalent to every white squadron tested. In some categories, formation discipline, mission completion rate, sortie generation per aircraft, they were better. The disbandment order was not signed. The experiment would live, but the men in Tunisia did not yet know any of this. And on the morning of January 27, 1944, they were about to be handed something that would settle the argument permanently, not with statistics, but with smoke. The Allied landings at Anzio had begun 5 days earlier. American and British troops had come ashore south of Rome, hoping to outflank the German line and break the long winter stalemate. Instead, they had become pinned against the beach. The Luftwaffe came in waves, day after day, trying to crush the bridgehead before the Allies could push inland. The 99th was sent to defend the sky above the beach. That morning, 15 P-40 Warhawks lifted off from Capodichino airfield outside Naples and turned north. The squadron was now under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George S. Roberts. Among the flight leaders climbing north that morning was Captain Charles B. Hall, the same Charles Hall who 6 months earlier had drunk warm Coca-Cola from a bottle saved for the first Tuskegee victory. Hall had grown thinner in those 6 months. The skin around his eyes had darkened from too many hours behind a canopy. He had been waiting for this morning his entire life. When the 99th reached Anzio, the sky was already filled with German aircraft, Focke-Wulf 190s, Messerschmitt 109s. The Luftwaffe had committed everything it could spare to the beachhead, and the German fighters were diving toward the American transport ships in the harbor. Hall keyed his microphone. Stay together, stay with me. What happened in the next 90 minutes was not a battle, it was a demonstration. Captain Hall took the first kill, a Focke-Wulf that turned across his nose at 3,000 feet. Lieutenant Robert Dees took the second. Lieutenant Howard Ball, Lieutenant Lemuel Custis, Lieutenant Willie Ashley, each one scored, each one flying the same outdated Warhawks the Army had handed them with the unspoken expectation that the aircraft, like the men, would prove inadequate. The afternoon mission added 3 more. In a single day, one single day, the 99th Fighter Squadron shot down more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter squadron operating over Anzio that day. The next morning they did it again. By the close of January 28th, the squadron had destroyed 12 confirmed German aircraft in 48 hours of combat. More victories in 2 days than they had recorded in the previous 7 months combined. When the radio messages reached headquarters, there was a long silence on the other end. Then the orders began to change. The squadron that had spent 7 months flying meaningless patrols over an empty sea was now being placed at the center of the air battle for Italy. The reports going back to Washington no longer suggested withdrawal. They asked, instead, for more squadrons like the 99th. The men who had been told they could not fight had just shown the Army Air Forces what fighting looked like. But this was only the beginning. In February of 1944, 3 more Tuskegee fighter squadrons crossed the Atlantic, the 100th, the 301st, the 302nd. They were combined with the 99th into a single unit. The 332nd Fighter Group. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., promoted on the 29th of May 1944, his eagles still bright on his collar, was given command. The group was sent to a small dirt airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, a place called Ramitelli. It had been built on a slope of farmland near the village of Campomarino, scraped flat by bulldozers and laid with steel matting that turned to mud when it rained. The pilots slept in tents. The officers' mess was a converted barn. There was no club, there was no running water at first, there was only the airfield and the work. Ramitelli was not a base, it was a beachhead, and from this airfield the 332nd Fighter Group was now expected to fly the longest and most dangerous missions of the European War. Bomber Escort, deep into the German Reich, attached to the 15th Air Force, the strategic bomber arm operating out of Italy, hammering the oil refineries of Romania, the rail yards of Austria, the aircraft factories of southern Germany. In June of 1944, General Nathan F. Twining, commanding the 15th, ordered a new identification system. Every fighter group under his command would receive a distinctive paint scheme so that bomber crews could recognize their escorts at a glance. Blue noses, yellow tails, checkered wings. The 332nd was assigned red, not a stripe, not a band. The entire tail surface of every Mustang in the group, crimson. Bright enough to be seen from a mile out, against any sky, in any weather. The pilots painted the tails themselves, working into the night with brushes and buckets of Red Army paint. When the sun rose the next morning over Ramitelli, an entire group of P-51 Mustangs stood on the muddy steel matting with tails the color of fresh blood. The bomber crews did not yet know who they were. The bomber crews only knew this. The red-tailed Mustangs did not leave them. In the brutal attritional air war over southern Germany and Austria and Romania, fighter pilots were rewarded for one thing above all others: kills, aerial victories. A pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft became an ace. An ace got his name in the newspapers. An ace went home with medals and a parade in his hometown and a story he could tell his grandchildren. And the way to get kills was to leave the bombers. When the German fighters rose to attack a fortress formation, most American escort pilots did what fighter pilots had always done. They chased. They dove on the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs and rode them down for the kill, and in doing so they left the bombers behind, exposed, alone for the minutes it took to come back. Sometimes the bombers were still there when the escorts returned, sometimes they were not. Colonel Davis had given an order on his first day at Ramitelli, and he had repeated it every day since. Stay with the bombers. It was that simple. 5 words. The pilots of the 332nd were forbidden from breaking formation to chase kills. They would not be aces. They would not have their names in the newspapers. They would do instead the unglamorous work of staying close, weaving above the fortress streams, holding the line, refusing to be drawn away by the easy prey the Germans deliberately offered as bait. It cost them, individually, the recognition they had earned. It saved bomber crews they would never meet. Word began to spread through the 15th Air Force the way word always spreads among men in danger. In hangars and at briefings, in the long sleepless nights before missions, the crews of the B-17s and the B-24s began to notice something. The red-tailed escort did not abandon them. The red-tailed escort stayed when other escorts left. The red-tailed escort, when the Focke-Wulfs came in screaming from 12 o'clock high, was already turning into the attack instead of away from it. The crews did not, at first, know that the men in those Mustangs were black. The 332nd was operating under strict communications discipline, and the bomber crews never saw the pilots on the ground at home base. They saw only the red tails against the cold blue of the high Alps. When the truth finally reached them, through a rumour, through a chaplain's offhand remark, through a maintenance crew at a forward field where a damaged fortress had limped down, most of them did not care. They had been escorted home alive. A waist gunner from Pennsylvania in a memoir written decades later would put it as plainly as it had ever been put. He had no opinions about the colour of a pilot's skin, he wrote. He only knew that on the day his fortress lost an engine over Yugoslavia, the red-tailed Mustang that flew alongside him all the way back to Foggia, slowing his own aircraft to keep pace with a crippled bomber, did not abandon his crew. And every man on board lived to see another sunrise because of it, and then the kills started to come anyway. On July 12, 1944, a 23-year-old lieutenant from Langston, Oklahoma, named Joseph Ellsbury, led a flight of 4 Mustangs into a swarm of German fighters over southern France. The bombers had to be protected. Ellsbury stayed with them. He stayed with them while turning into successive attacking groups of Focke-Wulf 190s. He stayed with them while firing in short, disciplined bursts. When the engagement ended, 3 Focke-Wulfs were burning on the ground below him. 3 kills, 1 mission, while obeying the order to stay with the bombers. But before Ellsbury's day came, there was June 25th. On the morning of June 25th, 1944, a flight of 8 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 332nd Fighter Group lifted off from Ramitelli on a routine fighter sweep along the northern Adriatic. Among the pilots was a tall, quiet first lieutenant from St. Louis named Wendell Pruitt, the kind of pilot who never raised his voice and never missed. They were patrolling near Trieste when Pruitt spotted something below them on the water, a warship. It was an Italian destroyer, the former Giuseppe Missori, now flying the German naval ensign under the designation TA-22, taken over by the Kriegsmarine after Italy's surrender. The ship was at anchor. Her anti-aircraft gunners were not yet at their stations. Fighter pilots did not sink destroyers. Fighter pilots flew above destroyers and reported their positions. Sinking a warship required bombers or torpedoes. A Thunderbolt carried neither. Pruitt rolled inverted and dove. What followed was 8 Thunderbolts strafing a German warship at masthead height, their 50 caliber rounds tearing through the deck plates, through the gun crews, through the bridge. They came in from the bow, they came in from the stern, they circled and came in again. They emptied their ammunition belts into the hull until the ammunition was gone. The TA-22 began to list. Smoke poured from her bridge. Her anti-aircraft fire grew ragged, then silent. When Pruitt and his flight leader led the formation back to Ramitelli that afternoon, the destroyer was burning at her moorings. She would never sail again. It remains to this day the only enemy warship in the history of the United States Air Force damaged beyond repair by aerial gunfire alone. No bombs, no torpedoes, just 8 black pilots and their machine guns. The men out of Ramitelli were no longer an experiment, they were the war, and then came July 18th. The mission that morning was Memmingen, a Luftwaffe airfield deep in southern Germany, 200 miles south of Munich. The 15th Air Force was sending B-17s of the 5th Bomb Wing to destroy the field and the aircraft on it. The 332nd Fighter Group was assigned escort. 66 red-tailed P-51 Mustangs lifted off from Ramitelli before dawn. The Mustangs were supposed to rendezvous with the fortresses over the Adriatic and proceed together north into Austria, then west into Germany. But the bomber formation was late. The 332nd circled over the rendezvous point for 45 minutes, burning fuel, holding station, waiting. When the bombers finally appeared, they were not where they were supposed to be. They had drifted east. The fighter escort had to push hard north to catch them. And by the time the red-tailed Mustangs closed on the bomber stream, the Luftwaffe was already there. Not a few interceptors, not a squadron. The Germans had committed nearly 100 fighters to defending Memmingen. Messerschmitt 19s, Focke-Wulf 190s, twin-engine destroyers, vectored against the bombers from multiple altitudes, multiple directions, in a coordinated attack of a scale the Tuskegee airmen had never encountered. The next 20 minutes were savage. A 21-year-old captain named Clarence "Lucky" Lester, 5 feet 6 inches tall, soft-spoken, the son of a brick mason from Chicago, turned into a flight of 3 Messerschmitt 109s coming down on the bombers and destroyed all 3 in a sequence, so fast his wingman could not call them out in order. Lieutenant Walter Palmer claimed a 4th. Lieutenant Jack Holsclaw shot down 2 more. By the time the engagement broke off, the red-tailed Mustangs had claimed 12 German aircraft destroyed. But the bombers were already burning. When the smoke cleared, 15 B-17s from the 5th Bomb Wing had been shot down. 150 American airmen were dead, captured, or missing in the cold mountains of southern Germany. It was the worst single-day loss any unit escorted by the 332nd Fighter Group would ever suffer. In the after-action reports, blame began to flow. Some bomber officers, looking at their losses, pointed at the red tails. Some senior commanders, looking at the political record of the Tuskegee experiment, did the same. The accusations were not always written down. They did not have to be. By the time Colonel Davis landed back at Ramitelli that evening, the whispers had already begun in the rear echelon clubs. The Negro pilots had failed at Memmingen. The Negro pilots had let the fortresses die. Colonel Davis filed his combat report. He defended his men. He pointed to the late rendezvous. He pointed to the impossible numbers. He pointed to the fact that the 332nd had claimed 12 kills against a force that outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. The accusations did not stop. What Colonel Davis could not yet prove, what no one in the 15th Air Force would prove for more than 60 years, was that most of those 15 fortresses had already been hit by German fighters in a separate engagement on a different vector, well outside the protective range of any escort. The bombers Davis was being blamed for losing were bombers his pilots had never had the chance to defend. The truth would not surface until 2007. In the long shadow of Memmingen, the men of the 332nd Fighter Group flew the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Because they had no choice but to keep flying. Because somewhere in Washington, the order to disband them was being drafted all over again. And because the worst was still ahead of them. A German jet was about to enter the sky over Berlin. The German jet did not look like an aircraft. It looked like a knife. The Messerschmitt 2 was the first operational jet fighter in the history of warfare. It had no propeller, 2 turbojet engines slung beneath swept wings. A top speed of 540 miles per hour, more than 100 miles per hour faster than the best Mustang in the American inventory. It carried 4 30mm cannons that could take apart a flying fortress in a single firing pass. By March of 1945, the Luftwaffe had fewer than 200 of them ready for combat. But 200 Me-262s, dropped into the middle of a bomber stream, could destroy more aircraft than the rest of the German Air Force combined. On March 24, 1945, the 15th Air Force in Italy was given a mission that would push the entire bomber escort doctrine of the war past its breaking point. 1,600 miles, round trip from Italy to Berlin to flatten the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory at the southern edge of the capital, the longest fighter escort mission the 15th had ever attempted. Through the heart of the Reich, across airspace defended by the elite jet unit of the Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 7, flying the only operational jet fighters in the world. The 3 and 32nd Fighter Group was assigned the lead. 43 red-tailed P-51 Mustangs took off from Ramitelli before sunrise. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., 32 years old, led the formation himself. Among the pilots was a 23-year-old lieutenant from New York named Roscoe Conkling Brown, a quiet, studious officer who, before the war, had graduated from Springfield College in Massachusetts, and who, after the war, would earn a doctorate and become a college president. Behind him flew Lieutenant Earl Lane, a Mustang pilot known for the precision of his deflection shooting, and behind Lane flew Lieutenant Charles Brantley, 21, a pilot the squadron simply called Calm. None of them had ever fought a jet before. The bombers crossed the Alps. The Escort climbed to 25,000 feet. Berlin appeared as a smudge of dark grey smoke on the northern horizon, the city already burning from earlier raids of the day, and then the Me-262s came up to meet them. There were many. They came in fast and high, accelerating to speeds the Mustangs could not match, slicing through the fortress formations from above and below. The American bomber crews watched, helpless, as German jets emerged from clouds at 540 miles per hour and broke off in the same instant. Roscoe Brown saw one. He had studied the jet's weaknesses. The Me-262 was fast in a straight line but slow to turn. It could not climb as steeply as a Mustang at certain altitudes. And, most critically, its pilots had a blind spot directly behind, where the engine nacelle blocked the rear view. Brown did not turn into the jet. He turned away from it. Then he climbed. He pushed his Mustang up at a 15-degree angle, gained altitude the jet was not expecting him to gain, and slid into the blind spot at 2,000 feet of separation. He fired 3 long bursts. The Me-262 began to disintegrate. The German pilot bailed out at 24,500 feet, his parachute opening into the cold thin air over Berlin. Roscoe Brown had just shot down a jet. A mile away, Earl Lane was setting up an angle that no fighter pilot in any war had ever attempted. He was tracking a second Me-262 at the very edge of effective range, 200 yards, a deflection shot at a target moving faster than 500 miles per hour, computed by the new K-14 gyroscopic gun sight that the 332nd had only just received. He fired. The jet came apart. To the day he died, no one who had been in the air that morning could quite explain how Earl Lane had hit a target at that range with a single burst of .50 caliber fire. The combat report listed the kill as confirmed. Lieutenant Charles Brantley scored the third. In one engagement, the red-tailed Mustangs had destroyed more Messerschmitt 262s than the entire United States Army Air Forces had managed to destroy in the war up to that point. The bombers reached Berlin. The Daimler-Benz factory burned. The 332nd Fighter Group escorted every surviving fortress back across the Alps to Italy. For the mission, the group received a Distinguished Unit Citation, the highest unit decoration the United States military could award. Colonel Davis read the citation that night. He did not save the paper. What he saved instead was a list of names, pilots of the 332nd who had not returned over the course of the war. By the spring of 1945, that list ran to 66 men. One of those names was not on it, but the man behind it was sitting at that moment behind barbed wire, several hundred miles to the north. His name was Alexander Jefferson. Lieutenant Alexander Jefferson was 22 years old. He had been shot down on the 12th of August 1944, his 19th combat mission, while strafing German radar installations on the southern coast of France. Flak had taken his P-51. He had bailed out, injured on landing, and been captured by German soldiers before he could crawl into the underbrush. He expected to be killed. He was not killed. He was interrogated. The German officer who questioned him spoke English with an American accent. He had a folder. The folder contained Jefferson's full file, the name of his hometown in Detroit, the address of his parents' house, his mother's maiden name, his father's profession as a chemist at a Detroit copper works, the squadron number of the 332nd Fighter Group, the location of Ramitelli Airfield, and the names of officers Jefferson had served alongside. The German officer slid the folder across the table. "We know who you are, Lieutenant. We know more about you than your own country wishes to know." Jefferson was sent to Stalag Luft III, the same prison camp from which 76 Allied airmen had tunneled out the previous year in the breakout that history would call the Great Escape. By the time Jefferson arrived, the tunnels had been filled in. The Luftwaffe guards were tired. The American prisoners, most of them bomber crew, most of them white, many of them men who had been escorted at some point in their tours by red-tailed Mustangs, looked at the new black officer and made a place for him at their table. Inside Stalag Luft 3, no one asked Alexander Jefferson which water fountain he was allowed to drink from. No one told him where he could and could not sit. No one questioned whether he was, in fact, an American officer. He was treated by the men who had fought beside him in the high air over Europe as one of their own. It was the most equality he had ever experienced. It was happening inside a Nazi prison camp. In January of 1945, with the Red Army closing on the camp, the Germans force-marched the prisoners of Stalag Luft 3 west through the snow. Jefferson walked for days in temperatures below zero. By the time American tanks rolled into Stalag 7A at Moosburg on the 29th of April 1945, he weighed 30 pounds less than the day he had been shot down. He walked out into a Germany of ruins. He was put on a transport ship to the United States. The ship docked in New York Harbor in June. The returning prisoners were marched down the gangplank under the eyes of newsreel cameras and waiting families and a brass band playing American songs. At the bottom of the gangplank, a military policeman directed the disembarking men into two lines, white soldiers to the left, colored soldiers to the right. Alexander Jefferson, who had flown 19 combat missions, been shot down over enemy territory, broken his ankle in a parachute landing, survived 9 months in a Nazi prison camp, and watched his country win the largest war in human history, stepped to the right. He stood in the colored line. He stood there for an hour. He did not write about anger. He wrote, years later, about a single thought that came to him on that pier. The thought was not bitterness. The thought was that the men who had treated him as an equal had been wearing the grey uniform of his enemy, and the men who were now sorting him by colour were wearing the uniform of the country he had fought for. That thought stayed with him for the rest of his life. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group came home to that same country. There were no parades. There was no public recognition. The Tuskegee experiment, having succeeded beyond any measure its critics had imagined, was simply allowed to fade into the routine business of demobilization. The pilots returned to whatever life had been waiting for them. Some went back to college on the GI Bill, some went into business, some like Roscoe Brown became academics, some like Lee Archer became corporate executives. Many never spoke of the war at all, because nobody believed them. Lee Archer, who scored 4 confirmed kills in the skies over Europe and was credited by some of his fellow pilots with a 5th that was never officially recognized, once explained why he stayed silent for decades. "A black fighter pilot," he said. "People hear that. They assume you are lying. The official record did the rest. The combat reports of the 332nd Fighter Group sat in archives. The mission logs went into boxes. The Distinguished Unit citation for the Berlin raid was filed away. The numbers were preserved untouched in cold storage at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Alabama, the very same Alabama where the experiment had begun." For 60 years the story slept. Beginning in the early 2000s, an Air Force historian named Daniel Hallman, working through those archives, began to publish his findings. He found that the long-standing wartime claim that the 332nd had never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters was not true. They had lost 27. But he also found something else. Across the same period, the other P-51 groups of the 15th Air Force, the white fighter groups flying the same aircraft over the same missions, had each lost on average 46 bombers on Escort. The Red Tails had outperformed every comparable unit in the theatre. Their protection rate was the best in the 15th Air Force. And the 15 fortresses that had fallen at Memmingen, the loss for which Colonel Davis and his pilots had been quietly blamed in the summer of 1944. Most of them, Hallman's research demonstrated, had been hit before the red-tailed Escort had ever reached the engagement zone. The 332nd had not failed at Memmingen. The 332nd had been blamed for losses that no Escort in the world could have prevented. 60 years late, the record was set straight. But the men by 2007 were already mostly gone. Of the 992 Tuskegee pilots who had completed training during the war, only about 300 were still alive when President George W. Bush stood at the rostrum of the Capitol Rotunda on the 29th of March 2007 and presented them collectively with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow. Some of them were in wheelchairs, some carried oxygen, many wept quietly as the citation was read. Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was not among them. He had died 5 years earlier, in 2002, having been promoted to 4-star general by President Clinton in 1998, 53 years after the day he had walked off a troop ship in segregated America and stepped back into the country that had silenced him at West Point. Roscoe Brown was there. He stood when his name was called. He thought, he said later, of the moment in the blind spot of the Messerschmitt 262 62 years earlier, and of the long quiet decades in between. In 1948, 3 years after the war ended, President Harry Truman had signed Executive Order 9981, ending segregation in the armed forces of the United States. Truman's advisers had told him the order was politically impossible. Truman had pointed at the combat record of the 332nd Fighter Group and told them it was politically impossible not to sign it. The order was the first crack in the wall of American segregation. Within 20 years, the wall would fall. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group did not bring down American segregation by themselves. They were one current in a much larger river, but the current was real. The kills were real. The bombers brought home were real. The names on the walls of military memorials, 66 pilots dead in combat, 84 dead in training, 32 captured, those names are real. And so was the moment, somewhere over the freezing sky above Berlin, on the 24th of March, 1945, when a 23-year-old black lieutenant from New York slid his Mustang into the blind spot of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world and pressed the trigger. The German pilot bailed out, the American pilot flew home, and in the long, slow telling of the 20th century, the story finally caught up with the truth. The Red Tails had won every war they fought, the one against the Luftwaffe, the one against the prejudice in their own uniform. And in the end, the longest one of all, the war against being forgotten.